الحرب الناعمة ما هي ومن يستخدمها وما هي أهدافها وما علاقتها بمكافحة الإرهاب وما هي سبل الحماية من هكذا حرب والتصدي لها وماذا يعني استخدام اللغة لتهيئة أرض المعركة وما هو الرد الفعال على المؤسسات العاملة تحت شعار منظمات حقوق الإنسان والتي هي جزء من هذه المعركة. الحرب الناعمة من الداخل. معكم زينب الصفار، تابعونا. حرب جديدة تنتهجها أطراف ودول مختلفة في المنطقة، إنها الحرب الناعمة أو حرب المعلومات. هي إجراء ضمني يتشكل من العمليات السياسية والثقافية والاستخباراتية التي تنتهجها دولة ما أو جماعة ما للتأثير على الجو العام وعلى المواطنين والقيام بالتغييرات المتوخاة في البلد الهدف. إذن من بين الخصائص المميزة للنزاعات الحالية والحروب المستقبلية الانقسام بين أسياد المعلومات وضحايا المعلومات، ومن هنا التركيز على الأجساد المشوهة والنساء الثكالى والكثير من جرعات الدم. والله حرام. والله حرام. هذا النوع من الحرب يشدد على ضرورة النظر إلى الصراع بأقصى درجات البساطة الأخلاقية، بساطة تقوم على فكرة الضحايا والمعتدي مما يتطلب إسقاط المعتدي. إذن هوليوود تحضر ميدان المعركة، وحرب المعلومات هذه كما يرى ضابط أمريكي عين نائباً لرئيس الأركان لدى المخابرات والمكلف بتعريف مستقبل الحرب في مجلة US Army War College Quarterly في عام 97. هذه الحرب لن تكون مرتكزة على المنطق الجيوسياسي، بل سيتم إنشاؤها مثل أي دراما هوليوودية من العواطف الجياشة، مشاعر الكراهية والغيرة والجشع، بدلا من الاستراتيجية هي التي ستحدد ظروف نزاعات حرب المعلومات، وسنكتب سيناريوهات وننتجها ونجمع أرباحنا. إن إبداعنا لا حدود له، يخلص الضابط الأمريكي. الباحثة منسقة الأنشطة في منتدى النزاعات أشلينغ بيرن تطلعنا على اللغة المستخدمة لتحضير ميدان المعركة وما يعني ذلك، وكيفية الحماية من حرب المعلومات والتصدي لها، وما هو الرد الفاعل على منظمات حقوق الإنسان المنخرطة في حرب المعلومات. Ashleyng Byrne, researcher and project coordinator at Conflicts Forum. Welcome to the Inside.
Thank you.
Actually, as we've been talking about this issue, that there is something of a new kind of war, which is the soft war or the information war. What is the nature of this information warfare?
I think the nature of this information war it's almost more important now than the sort of big military invasions we've seen of Afghanistan, of Iraq. And what we're seeing now is much more, particularly in Syria. I'll start by saying something about in 1997, the deputy head of US intelligence wrote in the US Army War College Journal, and he said, we're seeing a new kind of war now, and this is an information war. And he said, we write the script, we control the players, and he said societies who don't have the capacity just won't be able to keep up with what we're doing. And I think particularly in Syria, this is what we've seen. But if you look back at Iraq, at Afghanistan, the US was spending by 2011 something like nearly $600 million only on information operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think it's important to look back what they did in Iraq and Afghanistan to see how things have now developed in Syria.
Mm-hmm. Is it that effective, such kind of warfare?
So I'll give two examples from Afghanistan. One was we know this from WikiLeaks, and USA Today did a big study on this, that the Americans were producing 11 hours of radio and television programs a day in said by Afghans themselves. They said, because we're not Muslim, we'd be American, people wouldn't believe us, they don't trust us. It's important that it's
So they used the indigenous people to help them deliver their message.
They used indigenous people and they used NGOs, and we'll come to this later on Syria, but this is how this warfare is done. So information war is very much part of the sort of modern warfare. And we see this particularly in Syria, and in another study that Time magazine did, where they showed the cyber warriors, they called them, who've been trained by the US in Syria, but also wider. And it's all targeting countries where there's a strategic conflict with the US.
This type of war, I believe, has also been used in Iran too, but we're going to get back to this issue. But I want you to tell me, how does this relate to counterinsurgency, or what they refer to in the term of COIN?
Okay, it links to what I was saying, that very much the key component of COIN is winning hearts and minds and trying to find out who are the insurgents. And I think if the history of COIN is very interesting, that it first sort of was used in Vietnam, and it led to terrible results. You know, inevitably what was apparent was that torture and murder are a key component of COIN, of counterinsurgency. Because in order to get information of who are the insurgents at the village level, at the town level, there has to be either incentive. So in Vietnam, for example, the Americans gave money, $30 for an official, $40 for a district official, for example, who were killed by insurgents. But it's about trying to turn the population, turn key people in the population to your side, so you can then use them to implement.
So you can win the hearts and minds.
You win the hearts and minds, and they effectively become a proxy source, and a proxy force, who are then used in warfare. And we saw this very much in Iraq. And if you look at Bob Woodward, the very eminent US journalist, he did a study of the surge in Iraq. And he found that very similar issues of torture, murder, inevitably were part of what happened in Iraq. I think it was McChrystal's deputy said that one of the US Operation Command groups was effectively a killing machine. They just got out of control, and both them and the Iraqi forces they had trained were just killing, murdering, torturing people.
So we've seen that this information war is at the heart, and it gained centrality in the COIN, or at the heart of the method used or followed by the US forces. Now, how has this information warfare been used in the case of Syria?
I think in the case of Syria, probably it's the best example of how the information war is actually much more important than a normal battle, a sort of invasion. There's no invasion, there's no occupation, there's no intervention as yet, as we saw in Libya. But from the start, the US have admitted, Time magazine have exposed that from the start, the US were training activists who they called cyber warriors. This is done through NGOs, so Freedom House, the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. This is why some NGOs have a very dubious sort of role to play in conflicts like the conflict in Syria. And what they did is they trained thousands of cyber activists to produce false videos. That very much, not all false videos, but very much the aim was to create a narrative, so that in the West this would create a kind of consciousness that would facilitate regime change. Whether there would be foreign direct intervention, or, as we're seeing in Syria, that this is basically a proxy war. So the US, Britain, France, with their Gulf allies, are arming and funding and assisting with communications equipment the Free Syria Army and various other groups in Syria, including jihadist groups. And the whole aim is with the aim of overthrowing the government. It's been a rocky road in Syria, and a lot of the military tactics haven't worked. But at every stage, if you see the siege on Homs...
But you know, it's not enough as a warfare. It has to go hand in hand with the military tactics.
It goes hand in hand, and I think what you see, that's why what's interesting from the US Army documents and a lot of interviews that have been done, for example, from Iraq, and what General McChrystal was doing, that this in many cases, the information war is actually more important. It plays more of a much more important role than the actual military.
Or intelligence, perhaps.
And intelligence, and that's why you see in Syria, you know, in the wake of the killing of the US ambassador in Libya, the US have admitted that actually all of their best CIA officers were removed from Libya quite quickly, and they've all been based in the south of Turkey. So this is a very much intelligence information initiative there aren't American boots on the ground. As McCain has said, you know, we can do this without having American boots on the ground. We can use, you know, the proxy forces in Syria, for example, the FSA, to do what Brookings called the dirty work, basically killings and attacks on the Syrian government.
Right. How dangerous, Ashleyng, is such kind of warfare? I mean, is it winning in Syria the way it lost in Iran?
I think it's, in Syria, I would say they have won, and I think that's probably why President Assad said, you know, we can't win against this kind of media onslaught. I think Syria realized that it's just impossible to win. As the general who wrote in the US Army War College Journal wrote, you know, societies who can't keep up, they'll lose the war. And various commentaries have said that although Assad is winning the war on the ground and crushing forces and really defeating the insurgents, he's not winning the information war. And it's very difficult, you know, if you're up against this barrage of activists, you know, thousands of videos uploaded daily, well-trained activists who are given very high-tech, you know, communications equipment, internet in a box. There's now a project funded by the US government to give internet in a box. They train activists how to avoid being monitored by the Syrian security forces. Interestingly, the software comes from software that was developed by the US government to use it against drug traffickers and internet hackers. And they're now reusing that software in these cases, like in the case of Syria. And they're specifically giving money to fund research of how this can be used. I think it's the New America Foundation, which is a very prestigious American think tank, has a grant from the US State Department to actually look at this internet in a box to facilitate you know, this kind of immediate, being able to upload immediately onto Skype, onto YouTube, videos that portray this narrative, which is essentially that, you know, unarmed civilians are being killed by the Syrian security forces.
Why do you think that Assad is losing in face of such kind of a war?
Okay, I think President Assad and Syria is losing the information war because it's almost impossible to counter and to keep up with this kind of barrage of information. And you need to look at the players. There are not only the cyber warriors, as Time called them, there are foreign embedded journalists, and as the US Army learnt in Fallujah, and they said themselves, as we know through WikiLeaks, that these embedded journalists act effectively as the propaganda arm of the US Army. So we have, you know, by far the majority of Western journalists going into Syria are embedded effectively with the insurgents.
Can you give us an example on how?
Well, one example of this is Alex Thompson from Channel 4, who actually, and Channel 4's coverage in Britain, Channel 4 is one of the main British television channels. Channel 4's coverage takes almost 100% an anti-Assad government line. And they frame, as with most of the media in Britain, they frame the conflict in terms of, you know, unarmed civilians who were eventually forced to take up weapons to fight against the sort of brutality of the Syrian security forces. And it was only when Alex Thompson, and there were many Channel 4 journalists who were embedded with the Free Syria Army and with other insurgent groups. And it was only when Alex Thompson realized he had a very near miss. He was intentionally set up when he was just, I think it was outside Homs, by the insurgents to go and be effectively killed by the Syrian government forces. And he realized it was a trap, and they made a lucky escape. And it was only after that that he said publicly, you know, I know this was a trap, because a dead journalist killed by the Syrian government would look terrible in the West. And it fits the narrative that Assad's forces
so you
are
can
not
win
only,
again the hearts and minds of the people.
and winning the hearts and minds of people in the West. The aim being to try to create this sort of consciousness that will facilitate regime change. President Assad and his government have been completely demonized in the West. You know, he's shown in cartoons bathing in children's blood, and all this is part of this demonization of the government.
Ashleyng, we'll talk more about how to protect against such kind of warfare, but we have to stop for a short break. A short break, and we'll be back. Don't go away. Welcome back. Ashleyng, you were talking before the break about how dangerous is such kind of warfare. Now, how could one protect his society or his people against such kind of warfare?
As I said,
I mean, it's very difficult to understand that what is right and what is wrong, and who to believe and who not to believe.
This is part of the aim. The aim is to create a kind of false narrative,
a disarray,
picture, a disarray, and anyone who's a critic or tries to expose what's happening is in the Western press they're called Assad's useful idiots. So even very credible journalists like Seamus Milne, the point is if you take a critical line, they try to shut you up and try to dismiss your argument. And I think it was Brzezinski who said, look, because he's criticized the idea of foreign intervention in Syria, and he's argued in many articles, you know, this is just stoking the fires of what happened in Afghanistan in the 80s. And he said, you know, I'm not trying to defend brutality, I'm not trying to defend, there have been atrocities carried out by both sides. That's clear, that's what happens in war.
In wars,
and this is what happens in civil war. No one's trying to defend it. The point is that there are many cases when the West doesn't intervene. And why is Syria a particular case? And what they've tried to show is to create a narrative whereby there's this humanitarian justification and urgent need. And what you see in many phases of the conflict in Syria, the siege on Homs and the few foreign journalists who were in there, and the last dispatch by Marie Colvin before she was killed, you know, it very much focuses on these innocent children, babies, mothers who are being killed by these brutal forces, government forces. It's much more complicated than that. Syria, as we know, it's very much a kind of preparation for a war on Iran to weaken Syria. I'm not sure whether the aim is for President Assad to fall or to actually just weaken Syria. Syria, in many
Syria
cases,
already weakened?
Syria has been weakened, of course. I mean, Syria has been, it's almost like Iraq take two. Syria has been led down the path of sectarian civil war. And this has been instigated by the West with their Gulf partners. I'll give one example from Syria again. The Time magazine did a story in September. They were looking at how the weapons provided from the Gulf by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which are facilitated through Turkey, through an operations room in Istanbul, the kind of problems on the ground between the groups, and how some of the weapons are being distributed by a Lebanese parliament member from the Future Movement, and others just on the kind of dynamics between the different jihadist, Muslim Brotherhood, Free Syria army groups in Idlib. And another journalist who was writing about the same thing also was showing how even amongst the armed groups there's competition in terms of this info war.
There's a conflict, actually.
When he was there, he was with and he's been based with different insurgent groups, the Al-Farouk Brigade and others around Homs. Another group was filming operations that were undertaken by the Al-Farouk Brigade and claiming responsibility, because apparently the weapons in the north of Syria are distributed according to how many hits you have on YouTube and how many sort of sensational videos you can upload on YouTube. So these groups are effectively fighting amongst each other. They all have a PR.
They also want to win the information warfare.
They need to win the information warfare because they only get the weapons and the bullets and the RPGs.
And the money, perhaps, or the funding.
And the money, if they successfully show that they're able to carry out these operations. So even if it's not a successful operation in terms of targeting the Syrian government or if it doesn't have any military significance, it's significant the fact that they do a very, you know, graphic, sophisticated, sensational YouTube video.
Ashleyng, under such kind of circumstances, how can one respond to such kind of warfare?
I think what's important is people like us who are against this regime change project in Syria and who are trying to show what actually is happening. You have to really monitor the media carefully. It's very easy actually to see through a lot of this very humanitarian narrative that, you know, for example, in Britain, the Foreign Secretary, William Hague, every day is making statements, you know, we have this moral authority, you know, we have to show that we're better than this, there's this imperative to intervene. And it's to point out the hypocrisies. For example, in Libya, NATO refused to accept there were any civilian casualties from all the bombing raids on Libya. They said, if we don't define it as if we haven't investigated this as a casualty and proved it was a casualty, then it doesn't exist as a casualty. In Syria, so they've refused to accept, and the New York Times and Human Rights Watch did do research into this issue and showed that of course there were civilians killed. There was something like 9,000 sorties carried out. And there are very clear cases of where whole families were killed. But NATO, the point is NATO refused to accept there were any casualties.
Right.
In Syria, just to say, in Syria what we have on the other hand is that the British government and other Western governments are funding documenting centres, and they keep saying we're keeping records because of future war crimes cases that we can bring against President Assad and his government. You know, the hypocrisy of this. So it's really important to monitor the press and to watch out. There's a flourishing alternative press.
But you know, these counterfeit videos are not only used by the groups and the armed groups, but also used by prominent TV networks.
Yeah, there's been many, and this is the other thing. I think the coverage of the whole Arab awakening, and particularly Syria, which is cast in the West as a popular uprising against an authoritarian government. There are elements of that, but it's much more than that. I used to work in northern Syria, near Aleppo, in 2 Palestinian refugee camps with the UN. And, you know, there's a lot of corruption, people are very poor. There's a, you know, dire need of serious social, political, economic reforms in Syria. But the point is, this is not about reform. The Saudi Arabia and Qatar are certainly not fighting for the overthrow of the Syrian government.
Is this
because they want to have a sort of democratically elected government in Syria? They're certainly not. They're fighting because this, again, is part of the war in Iran, and they want to install a Saudi-influenced government.
Is this
which
why
would
you
be
are
accountable
against the
to
regime change in Syria?
The Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has said that why Syria is so important is because how the conflict in Syria is solved will determine how future conflicts are solved. The West and their allies, as they did in Libya, they set up a Friends of Syria, Friends of Libya group to bypass the UN Security Council and effectively to sort of implement a regime change project, bypassing any opponents. In Syria it hasn't worked. Russia and China have consistently resisted any attempt at forceful intervention in Syria, even whether it's under the pretext of humanitarian corridors or no-fly zones or...
Yes. Allow me to go back to the issue of the information warfare, and at the heart of this information warfare is the proxy human rights organizations. How effective are these organizations, and how to stand in face of such kind of organizations and just let the people know?
In some ways they've been very effective. I mean, in the West the narrative has been created that this is, you know, the President Assad's government killing unarmed protesters who are protesting against authoritarian rule in Syria.
For the sake of reform.
For the sake of reform and democracy, etc. And most people believe this. Increasing numbers don't believe it. And I think with the increasingly apparent failures in Iraq, in Afghanistan, people just don't trust this kind of simplistic narrative. The trouble is, a lot of people in the media and in certain think tanks, they are very closely aligned with this regime change project. So you have organizations like the ICG, the International Crisis Group, calling for arming of the opposition in Syria. I mean, this is illegal. It's it's illegal under the UN Charter to arm forces for toppling a sovereign government. And for example, the leader of the opposition in Turkey, Frank Logolu, has said, you know, he's been very vocal saying what the Turkish government doing is illegal. This is violating the sovereignty of a neighboring country. But the narrative is sort of couched in these humanitarian terms. so that it creates this public support in the West for. So the important thing is to counter this narrative, and whether it's by human rights groups, you know, some of us were saying from the start that there were activists who were creating these videos. Demonstrations were held in Syria solely that they could be videoed and put up on the website. They lasted like 1 or 2 minutes.
How can one respond to these?
Well, it's important to
How can one stop their effect?
By exposing the hypocrisy, the lies, the fake videos, by exposing all of this and exposing how this is part of, and really challenging the media. You know, even the use of the word regime, they use the Syrian regime. Now, in the Western media, they'll never say the Saudi regime. It's the Saudi government. And a report, an independent report done by the BBC Trust, which looked at the BBC's coverage of the Arab awakenings, they raised this as a question. They said, you know, why does the BBC use the word regime for Syria, but not for Saudi Arabia or Qatar?
Yes.
You never hear the word Qatari regime.
Yes.
You know, it's the Qatari government or the Saudi government.
What can you tell us about the evolution of the color revolution techniques, and what and where is next on the list? Quickly, if I may ask.
I think the color revolution, it had a very specific context in Eastern Europe, and you need to look at how it brought about the sort of neoliberal economic project for Europe. So it's important to kind of deconstruct what the color revolution kind of handbook and toolbox is, and how it's been used in different places. In Iran, it was used, you know, hugely, and the Green Movement received something like $450 million. The Green Movement itself, but other NGOs working, media activists in the US. So we've had one wave of this, and it failed in Iran. It could well likely happen again in the next Iranian elections, and no doubt NGOs will play a key part of this. Human rights groups, Amnesty, and although Amnesty and Human Rights Watch on Syria have done reports critical of the Syrian opposition and the insurgents, their overall message is, you know, we've got to intervene, we've got to do something. And this is similar to John McCain and all the neocons, you know. So the human rights organizations, I think we need to really closely look at what they're arguing. And where next? Probably Iran in 2013, when the next presidential elections happen, or 2014.
The way it happened in 2009, but it failed, apparently.
It failed, but it will happen again. And I think Russia is also a key target. And it's interesting to note that in September, the Russians kicked out US aid. They asked US aid to leave Russia, even though they were funding, you know, a couple of $1 billion, I think, of aid over some years. The role played by NGOs recently in the election of President Putin, they've realized that, you know, some NGOs play a very dubious role.
Right. Ashleyng Byrne, researcher and project coordinator at Conflicts Forum. Many thanks indeed for joining us.
Thank you very much.
إذن لقاء جديد وضيف جديد وأسئلة جديدة، والجواب يكون دائما من الداخل. من كل فريق عمل من الداخل، السلام عليكم.